Right, good evening, everyone. Hello, good evening and welcome. My name is James Dyke. I'm an Assistant Director of the Global Systems Institute, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's seminar, Overshoot, How the World Surrendered to Climate Breakdown, which is going to be given by Andreas Malm and Wim Carton. I am super pleased that we've been able to get Andreas and Wim to come visit us today. A few years ago, I wrote an article around net zero that talked about overshoot, and it generated quite a bit of interest. And it was after we published that article that I discovered that pretty much everything that I had said had been previously said by Wim in much more detail and rigor, and I was sufficiently mortified. Earlier this year, I thought I would follow up that article with something specifically about overshoot, given there is increasing reliance on large-scale carbon dioxide removal and even geoengineering as an attempt to claw back temperatures once we exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius. So imagine my surprise when I discovered that Wim Carton, this time with Andreas Malm, has written a whole book about this topic, and that is the title of this evening's talk. So they're currently on a very busy book tour. If anybody has, I'll do this bit for you. If anybody has got a copy, I'm sure they'd be very happy to sign it. I was able to read a review copy earlier in the year, and it really is excellent. So when I heard that they were going to be in the country as part of basically an international book tour, I said, you have got to come and visit us. And we are very pleased and grateful that they have. We also have some people joining us online. And the plan for this evening is going to be that we will have a talk for about half an hour or so. And then we were going to have a Q&A that I will do my very best to manage. It's a bit of a febrile moment in politics, given what appears to be happening in the United States. So I don't think that needs to completely derail our conversation. In fact, I would argue it's even more reasons why you should buy Overshoot, How the World Surrendered to Climate Breakdown. So anyway, that's enough of me. Please join me in welcoming to the Global Systems Institute and University of Exeter, Andreas Malm and Wim Carton.
Thank you so much, James, and it's a pleasure to be here, and a pleasure also to finally be able to talk about these things with you. I mean, obviously, we've seen your work, and if anything, you've been much more successful than I or maybe even Andreas has at marketing and publicizing your work. So yeah, we're going to talk about this book that we just published a month ago with Verso, for sale at your better bookshop. Yeah, it's going to be hard not to talk about what just happened in the United States in a way. So, you know, this book kind of provides a diagnosis of the madness of climate politics at this very moment in some ways. But just the re-election of Trump shows that, you know, there's many things you could add to that. And if anything, we're being pushed into ever more madder territory. So one could add diagnosis to what we've written here. Andreas, of course, has previously done in some of his other books. What do we mean by overshoot? Maybe if you're students of James, you're very familiar with this idea, but I'm just going to briefly talk you through the notion of overshoot and why it matters somehow. And in the book, we basically talk about two things. The first thing is, of course, this idea of crossing the temperature thresholds that have been established, most notably through the Paris Agreement in 2015. So back then, countries agreed that we should limit warming to 2 degrees and work towards limiting it to 1.5 degrees. But we're already at this moment where, you know, we're on the threshold of exceeding that lower limit. This is from this summer. Actually, the data is, there's more updated data on this, but I couldn't find it with a baseline of 1.5 degrees. But already in the past 12, 14 months or so, average temperatures on this planet have been on the verge of 1.5 degrees or actually far above it. Now, officially, you know, temperature thresholds are calculated on averages, and so it will take a few decades before any climate scientist will officially denounce that 1.5 degrees is formally buried. But I think it just connotes this moment that we're in, right? This kind of moment where, you know, climate politics is somehow in this weird constellation of trying to achieve 1.5 still, if you look at the narratives that are happening at the UN level, while de facto, right, temperatures are already kind of verging beyond that. So that is the first instance of what overshoot means. It essentially means the moment when we cross these thresholds. And in the book, we're interested in exploring what is driving this. What is, you know, what continues to drive climate politics at this moment beyond this threshold. And we talk a lot about business as usual and fossil fuel interest, and we do that in the book as well. And we're going to do that later as well. But I first want to set up something else. And that is related to what James has written about as well, and what comes out of the scientific community. And this is what in the book we call programmatic overshoot. Because one key question, I think, is how overshoot, the crossing of these temperature thresholds, is increasingly going to be justified. And one way in which it is being done so, and has been for, you know, almost 2 decades now in some parts of the scientific community, is by saying that crossing 2 degrees, 1.5, doesn't actually have to be a problem per se, because we can, at some point, through technologies of sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere, deploying them at very large scales, reverse temperatures again. So if you look at what happened when you know, the temperature targets were established, essentially, the models that the scientific community is using to project how we can mitigate, how we can stay below 2 degrees and 1.5, the ones that are very influential in the IPCC, had built in from the very beginning this idea that, you know, the best, most optimal pathway to these temperature thresholds was by first exceeding them. That's always been at the core of what these models do. And talking about these models is like, you know, I always feel a bit bad because it's such a niche kind of topic in some ways. It can get a bit nerdy, but it's super important because these are really the most influential kind of messages that come out of the IPCC reports in many ways. And I would argue, and we argue in the book, that, you know, they've become a major kind of reflection, or they've become a major narrative that is being picked up by policymakers and by corporations as well. So what happens essentially is that in these integrated assessment models, there's an assumption that by the end of the century, we'll have net negative emissions, meaning we'll suck more CO2 out of the atmosphere in aggregate than we keep putting in. And they do assume that we keep putting in quite a bit of emissions often. And by doing so, we'll lower temperatures again, and we'll be able to compensate for, in some cases, quite extensive amounts of temporary overshoot. Now, we don't really talk about this in this book. We have a second book that delves into these technologies in much more detail. One could say a whole lot about this. I'm not going to do it here, just to say that there are a lot of ways of, you know, sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere. This isn't rocket science in some way. There's many, many methods. The key takeaway is that none of them comes for free, right? There's lots of caveats with all of these technologies, including, and most importantly, perhaps, with the land-based methods in terms of how much land you would actually need to, you know, do this. The point being that, you know, it exists. We can question how they're being used, how they're being deployed, what it would mean on these large scales. But, you know, purely physically, it's possible to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere. Now, why did these models become so reliant on overshoot? We argue in the book that essentially, if you take the messages from the broader climate community, from the broader climate science community seriously, you know, we need to stay within these temperature limits. Without overshoot, you need revolutionary change. You need such a massive overhaul of society, of all aspects of society, as the IPCC itself says elsewhere, right? That you would need to leave an enormous amount of infrastructure, value investments in fossil fuels, fossil fuel reserves, all of this stranded. You would need to basically destroy that value, that economic value that is already calculated. And for 1.5 degrees, of course, that, you know, is the steepest curve. So, I mean, that translates into these very steep kind of decarbonization curves. And essentially the models, which are economic models working on economic assumptions, assume that this is not just unfeasible, but also undesirable. Because they're cost optimizing models. They work, you know, within certain limitations. You know, this kind of radical revolutionary scenario is something that is depicted as to be avoided. And therefore, you know, they come up with something else. And the way this happens, and I'm just going to give some very brief examples, is by all kinds of assumptions that are being put into these models. Neoclassical economics is kind of the main framework through which this operates. You have discount rates, for example, that if you halve them, you also halve the amount of overshoot. You have assumptions about costs of renewables that have been very conservative, which means that, you know, the amount of renewable, the scaling of renewables that is in these assessments tends to be underestimated. These are papers, for example, illustrating that the actual scale up of renewables is exceeding what is being projected in many of the scenarios. So what is happening in reality is faster than what is, you know, being modeled. And it happens also more explicitly, right? By essentially putting boundaries around what mitigation is possible and is not possible. The speed of mitigation is, for example, directly moderated. There's assumptions being made about how fast you could reduce or phase out fossil fuels, et cetera, et cetera. So the point being not that, you know, we can instantaneously, you know, cut off everything, and that wouldn't, you know, entail some kind of trade-offs. There's obviously, you know, implications with very, very rapid mitigation. This is why, you know, the message or the argument that we make here goes for 1.5 degrees, but as we said, you know, we're on the verge of 1.5 degrees. The risk rather is that you see this logic being perpetuated for whatever limit comes next, right? That the logic of overshoot becomes like a dominating logic in climate politics, that this is, you know, the best way to go about achieving ambitious target. So essentially it looks like this. What the models do is they have this built-in need, this built-in imperative to push emission reductions, phase out of fossil fuels as far into the future as feasible within the model, and compensate for that by, you know, allowing for this kind of overshoot that is then, you know, demanding net negative emissions, so massive amounts of CO2 drawdown from the atmosphere. It's a form of what we argue is capital protection. You don't want to scrap all this value, all this economic value that, you know, exists, and therefore you have this kind of gradualization of mitigation, a gradualism, an assumption of the need for gradual, an avoidance of this kind of revolutionary imperative that would otherwise be necessary. Now, if you make this argument to climate scientists, as we try to do, I just want to say that this is, I like this quote because it captures it very well. Essentially, it says that, you know, if you look at what is happening in these models, they're kind of meaning-making machines. They define what is possible and what is best. They're a form of policy-based evidence-making, turning around the notion of evidence-based policy. In that, you know, the modelers make assumptions about what is feasible politically, then they put those assumptions into their models, and then policymakers can use those models to justify what they're doing. And this is hugely problematic, of course. Essentially, it's, you know, the limitations of possible climate futures are somehow being, you know, determined by very kind of intransparent forms of economic assessment. Now, you know, to make this argument we wrote this piece for The Conversation a month ago or so, where we basically set up the basics of this argument. And the pushback you get very easily is that this is somehow depicting climate science as kind of the main culprit of overshoot, and that there's even maybe a conspiracy of economists or climate scientists that are somehow working to make the Paris Agreement targets impossible. This is, of course, not what we're arguing. None of these people working on these models are doing this with bad intent or deliberately. This is not we're not talking about some kind of conspiracy or somebody consciously doing it. This is the inevitable consequence of working within very conservative assumptions that derive from neoclassical economics that are being unquestioned. And so the whole point is to kind of broaden that and try to push the boundaries of what is deemed possible and not possible in terms of near-term mitigation. That's what I would argue is the point here. And the reason this matters, of course, is not just because it's in the IPCC, but because the whole point of these exercises is to inform policy. And the IPCC, in some ways, of course, has not been taken very serious by policymakers, but some certain things are definitely being heard. I mean, we would argue that if you take seriously the idea that we can still keep 1.5 alive or even 2 degrees, while what policymakers are also doing, of course, continuing to license massive amounts of fossil fuel, continuing to give out massive amounts of fossil fuel licenses and new forms of exploration and so on. The only way you can bring those two things together is by going through overshoot. So there's an implicit reliance on overshoot, on the need for net negative emissions in what policymakers are doing. And it's the same with corporations, right? Corporations are very often actively referring back to what the IPCC, these models, are concluding to justify what is in their climate plans. And this is an example from Shell, already from 2019, for example. Often, they will say, like, the IPCC says that this much amount of carbon removal is necessary, without, questioning all of the assumptions that go into that, seeing that as some kind of objective truth, to then claim that, their own business model is not at risk because we will be able to suck out net negative emissions by 2100. And this means, in the case of Shell, then, that the potential for dramatic short-term change is limited, and that doesn't have to mean that we have to give up on 1.5 degrees, because we have this alternative that basically exists. Andreas, I'm going to give it over to you.
Sure. Thank you. So, after having laid out this argument in the book, we delve a little bit deeper into the material forces driving overshoot. And we're looking specifically into the logic of investment into fossil fuels and how such investment perpetuates and drives business as usual beyond these temperature limits. And we're focusing quite extensively on the category of fixed capital, drawing on Marx and political economy. And to just make this argument very simple here, consider the case of Chevron and BP that have recently acquired licenses to drill for oil and gas off the waters of Palestine. Of course, they're in agreement with the occupation. They will now explore for oil and gas, drill for it, invest money into that. And if they find what they're looking for, they will pour a lot of money into constructing the requisite infrastructure, the platforms, the drills, and everything. This represents fixed capital, capital that demands a return on investment, a profit in the future. Now, imagine that they explore and they find and they build and they start extraction within the next, let's say, 2 years. And then imagine that on the 3rd year, some entity, some government, some institution declares that now we can have no more expansion of fossil fuel production, and you guys have to abandon these fields that you have just started exploring. This will mean a tremendous loss to BP and Chevron and to the banks and the asset managers with which they work, which pour their own capital into these projects, because these are generally extremely expensive projects that require the pooling of very large amounts of financial capital that then develops an interest in keeping these projects running. So every fresh investment in fixed capital in the production of fossil fuels creates an incentive to keep going for a long time. It will take years before these heavy investments have yielded enough money to recuperate the original investment. And then it will take more years to fully generate the whole potential of profits, which is, of course, the aim of these investments. So any new investment is a commitment to decades into the future of business as usual. And this is a central material driver behind this urge to go beyond temperature limits. Because as long as these investments continue, you are refueling the structural interest from capital in maintaining business as usual, regardless of where you are in terms of average rise in temperatures. So I hope you're getting the key argument, although I'm massively simplifying, and we try to draw on a body of critical political economy to make the case for how the investment in fixed capital creates this kind of inertia. What's happening on the ground since a couple of years is that this process is escalating, just as we're approaching the threshold of 1.5 degrees, or being on it, or even beyond it. What we're seeing is an investment frenzy from the large oil and gas companies. And this really took off on a higher scale after 2021-22, when there was an unprecedented profit bonanza in the fossil fuel industry. Saudi Aramco in 2022, the world's largest hydrocarbon corporation, by some measures, the world's largest capitalist corporation as a whole. In 2022, Saudi Aramco made the single largest profit that a corporation has ever made in the entire history of the capitalist mode of production. And of course, what it did with all this money, as capitalists are wont to do, was and is to reinvest that profit into even more expansion. So Saudi Aramco is now in the midst of its largest CapEx, or capital expenditure campaign or episode in its history. The same with all the other major oil and gas companies. ExxonMobil, Chevron, BP, Total, Shell, they all made their largest profits ever in 2022. And of course, cannot resist the compulsion, which is systemic, to use these profits to make even more profits, because that is what capital accumulation is all about. You might have seen the news that came out a week ago, or whenever it was, that BP, which in 2019-20 positioned itself as the oil and gas company with the greatest ambitions to invest in renewables, again reduced these ambitions to next to nothing, and reaffirmed its commitment to investing in fossil fuels, not in solar and wind. The same with BlackRock, which towards the just before the pandemic broke out, at the kind of crest of the climate activism, the wave of climate mobilization in 18-19, declared that now we are going to begin a process of retreating from fossil fuel investment. And then it did exactly the opposite. This is not, again, out of any kind of conspiratorial wish to destroy the planet. It is because these actors are caught in the logic of capital accumulation, which compels them to invest their capital where they can get the most profits. And something that we argue in the book, and that has also been argued recently by Brett Christophers to a great extent in much empirical detail in a book called The Price is Wrong, it is now abundantly clear that renewables, solar and wind, are totally incapable of producing rates of profit close to what you can get from oil and gas. And this profit differential keeps propelling this fossil fuel frenzy that we are seeing on a daily basis. And I think what this material process really generates is a kind of break with reality. So the fact that this fossil fuel frenzy is happening just as we are perched on the 1.5 degree threshold means that material forces working in the depth of capitalist society do not relate to the reality of climate breakdown. These forces are totally disassociated from the science of climate breakdown and from the ongoing experience of it. There is simply no connection between what we know about climate breakdown and what investment decisions private capital is taking around the world. These are as if they're existing in parallel universes. And a consequence of this is a kind of a general break with reality that takes a multiplicity of forms. And these overshoot models, which stretches the idea of limits to the extent that, okay, we have the idea here that we can best respect the limit by actually going beyond it and then returning by means of technologies that really don't exist in reality. Some of them do, but the key technology in these models, bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, that underpinned the whole notion of overshoot at that time was a totally fictional technology and largely still is. Is still one operational BECCS facility in the world in Illinois, right? And a couple of others may be on the way, but it's essentially an unproven technology, unlike solar power and wind power, that might possibly exist in the future. But banking on this irreal entity to solve the problems of climate change is just one symptom of this break with reality that emerges from an inability to confront the material drivers of business as usual. Or to put it differently, if you remain loyal to these material drivers, you have to break with reality. This takes many different forms. And what just happened in the US is another symptom of this. There have been 2 countries in the global north that have both suffered devastating floods due to extreme storms, and then shortly after elections in the past months, namely Austria and the US. A conjunction of absolutely disastrous floods and immediately after national elections. This hasn't happened in Spain because they don't have elections right now. In both Austria and the US, what happened was a victory for the far right, which is totally wedded to climate denial in both countries. In Florida, Donald Trump massively increased his votes and the Republicans fared better than ever, as far as I understand it, just after the disasters they've had there. And this is one of the many symptoms of a refusal to engage with reality. And I don't know how you guys feel about psychoanalysis and Freudian theory, but I personally feel, and I feel so more and more for every day, that we as social scientists do not have any other adequate source of analytical instruments for dealing with what's going on here, because it's so blatantly obvious that our societies are producing forms of denial that exist, that works through psychic mechanisms that cannot only be understood with, for instance, Marxian political economy. Although what Marxian political economy does is that it identifies the material drivers of the break with reality. So, in Freudian terms, the reality principle fundamentally is the idea that there are limits to what you can have. And everyone who has raised a child knows that raising a child is very much precisely about inculcating the reality principle, to move from the pleasure principle to the reality principle, which is about telling your child No, you cannot have everything you want all the time. No, you cannot have this because there are limits in reality. Capital is like a child that doesn't recognize that there are limits in reality. The capital that keeps being invested in fossil fuels absolutely refuses the idea that there are limits and that there is a reality with limits. And of course, Donald Trump is the personification of the absence of a reality principle. He's only an id, he's only his drives, and he doesn't recognize the existence of limits. So, to wrap up here, I think it's important to recognize the homology, the structural affinity between far-right climate denial of the kind that keeps winning elections in the advanced capitalist countries and the logic of overshoot in its more respectable scientific forms. You know, there has been this argument made again and again and again that we have moved beyond classical climate denial or denialism, and now we are in a phase of green capitalism, which is very much associated with this whole, you know, integrated assessment modeling, BECS, this, you know, carbon capture and all of these things, and that denialism is a thing of the past. This is the point of departure for Adrian Buller's book on green capitalism that some of you might have read, which is generally a very good book, but it repeats what I would consider to be, again, a proven illusion, namely the illusion that bourgeois civilization has moved beyond total climate denialism. This phenomenon just keeps coming back and being researched. So I don't think we should see overshoot and green capitalism and all of this as a kind of an opposite or an antithesis of far-right climate denialism, the one of the kind that just won the election. But rather, these are two two aspects of the same process, two sides of the same coin that kind of feed on each other, because both represent two different manifestations of the deeper break with reality that is going on in the depth of capitalist society. Yeah, this could potentially lead us into a discussion around geoengineering and Donald Trump and stuff like that, but I'll stop there and see. Yeah, okay. These chairs over there.
Yeah, I mean, you guys, you deserve a sit down. You can sit down. Yeah, so what we're going to do, we've got a microphone. I don't know if it's on. It's on?
It's on.
And I guess what I might do is field a few questions at a time. Yeah. And do my best to try and corral what hopefully is an animated and boisterous discussion. Yeah, but no, you can bring some chairs. You guys have deserved it. You can sit down. Yeah. Okay. So,
Okay, we sit. You want to sit? We sit.
whilst they organise themselves, yeah, keep your hands up. Sorry, I'm just organised. Yeah. Okay, so I will probably just go in, and so we'll take the first three. So
I've read recently that some of these huge renewable energy systems have been set up. The cost to produce a unit of electricity is actually much cheaper than producing fossil fuels. So I think that the market will just move. If that's true, then the market will move. Surely the market will move towards renewables.
so we've got. Are you right to do them in blunt chunks, or do you want to just respond?
Let's have a few.
Yeah. Okay.
Not too large chunks.
Yeah. Well, keep it snappy.
Yeah, no lecturing.
Please.
The question first is overshoot is also coupled with net zero, the concept of net zero instead of real zero. I'd like you to get into that. And then secondly, the problem with overshoot, how long and how much increase in greenhouse gas emissions will drive tipping points to much worse conditions. Though, as James Dyke informed me, this is very uncertain, so please address that.
Thank you. That was very good. If you pass it. So we've got markets.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'd welcome your views on two possible solutions. One, the socialist solution, taking the fossil fuel industry and bringing it into public ownership and then redirecting it. And secondly, kind of a market forces mechanism of increasing taxes on profits from fossil fuels towards 100%. Thank you.
Okay, so if I may editorialize, we've got questions around markets. Surely, you know, given that solar power is now the cheapest electricity that we've ever generated, market forces will just, you know, solve the problem. If they don't, then we've got tariffs or carbon taxes. And then from David, we've got this idea, well, even if we do that, maybe it'll be too late to avoid things like potential tipping points. So there could be more danger in overshoot than people.
Do we have a microphone or?
Oh, right, no, yeah, I mean, sure.
No?
Well, you were over here.
Uh-huh.
So you need to.
Markets and costs. So I mean the argument we make in the book, and I mean it's mainly built, as Andrea says, on this book by Brett Christopher's The Price is Wrong, is that cost alone is the wrong indicator to look at the potential success of renewables as a market-driven transition. And the reason, of course, is that when corporations invest, they're not interested in cost, they're interested in profit. And when you look at profit instead of cost, it's very clear that renewables are inferior when it comes to compared to fossil fuels. Now, that doesn't mean that cost doesn't matter, of course. I mean, that argument goes for as long as we're looking at what investors are interested in. And the majority of investors in the energy industry are, much of the money is with fossil fuel companies. So, I mean, that's why that argument matters, right? But of course, you have, other drivers of, renewable scaling, and renewables undoubtedly are scaling, and they're scaling very rapidly, right? And we see that in the European Union, for example. But the argument that Brett makes and that we agree with is that a lot of that is very much based on, subsidies and state interventions in the market to enable that. Or it's based on, consumer renewables. I mean, solar panels as something that you can buy as an individual and put in your house or something. When it comes to institutional investors, profit becomes a dominant driver of this logic. And then, I mean, it's very clear, and we document a lot of examples of, fossil fuel companies and major banks and so on. When they're trying to maximize profits, it's fossil fuels that they're still going for. And when they're investing in renewables, it's to cut the cost of, I mean, for example, was Equinor is building, wind and solar, but it's doing so to make extraction of fossil fuel cheaper, because for them that's it's a cost saving measure. They're not building out renewables on the same scale to actually make a profit. That's where fossil fuels still come in. Real zero and net zero, of course, that's I mean, so when we talk about carbon removal, that's definitely as I showed this graph, the IPCC looks at three main purposes of carbon removal, and net zero is like the main one in a way, besides overshoot. There's a lot to talk about there, but essentially the argument with real zero, as you say, is that the whole notion of net zero builds on some kind of compensation or offsetting of continued residual emissions with carbon removal. And the problem is that nobody has defined what residual emissions are, what they should be, how you define that category. There's an inbuilt kind of an inbuilt imperative or an inbuilt attraction to expand that category of residual emissions as much as possible. And you see that is exactly what a lot of companies are doing. Everybody's claiming their own emissions as unavoidable or residual in the future, because the residual can be both technological capacity, makes it impossible to decarbonize, or it could be economic, or it could be just political inconvenience. And we see all of that playing out. So the argument very clearly is that, we need to minimize those remaining emissions. There's a few sectors where very obviously we can't get rid of all emissions. That would be agriculture to begin with. There's always going to be, you always need to have a net zero agriculture, because there are always going to be emissions associated with harvesting crops, for example. But for many of the things that, net zero claims are currently being made, it's very questionable that, there's no actual emission reduction options for the removals that are being proposed. And tipping points is a very good question. So this is the main thing that we don't address in this book. There's a whole lot of things to say about that, and the piece that James wrote in the conversation touches on this. But this is one of the main points of the second volume that we've written, and that is coming out next year. And that talks about the whole notion of reversing climate change as a physical possibility. Where, as you say, right, I mean, 1.5 is critical, and because a lot of the tipping points that have been identified are concentrated in this space between 1.5 and 2 degrees. So the risk of crossing these tipping points, particularly when it comes to, the Amazon rainforest, for example, or global ocean currents, increased massively once you go past 1.5 degrees. So, I mean, fully agree that that puts in question the whole notion that we could ever actually reverse temperatures. And it's an extremely risky strategy, especially once you start reading into what, a shutdown of the Atlantic Ocean current would mean, for example. There's been a bit of media around this in recent weeks that you might have read. But I mean, these are dramatic consequences that just, show that assuming or planning for overshoot is it's not at all the same as staying within this limit and never crossing it to begin with.
Okay, so does it work? Yeah. So on the last question of do we prefer socialization of fossil fuel companies or raising taxes on their profits up to 100%? Is that correct? Yeah. I mean, I would personally be fine with either, and in favor of both. I think the idea of socializing fossil fuel companies and, forcibly shutting down their production and transforming them into entities for something completely different, such as production of solar and wind or carbon dioxide removal, is a good idea. We're far from this all over the world, with one exception. So now I'm going to go on my Colombian one, because I have a running love affair with the Colombian government. Colombia, I don't know much about Colombia. I haven't been there. But I know that Colombia has, for the first time in its history, a left-wing government that won a democratic election, largely because of the popular uprising in the country in 2019 that was then converted into a successful electoral campaign. And Colombia is the third largest fossil fuel producer in Latin America after Brazil and Venezuela. And it has for long been an economy totally dependent on fossil fuel production and export. So more than 50% of the export from Colombia is fossil fuels, oil and coal in particular. And now this is the only significant fossil fuel producer in the world that actually is run by a government determined to stop fossil fuel production in its territory. It's the only fossil fuel producer of note that has signed up to the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative that you might have heard of. And what President Gustavo Petro and not least his environmental minister Susana Mohammed are doing is that they're trying to implement a program for phasing out totally the production of fossil fuels in Colombia. Now, naturally, this is a program that is facing obstacles. What they've done so far is that they've ended the issuing of new licenses for exploring oil and gas. So in practice, banned further exploration of oil and gas. And the oil and gas industry works in the way that you deplete fields, and then you have to find new ones to keep the business going. And if you're not allowed to search for new ones, the business is coming to an end. So the projection here is that if this decision remains in force, oil and gas production in Colombia will be over in 2034. which is exactly what it needs to be, not only in Colombia, but all over the world. And early on, the left-wing government here used its National Energy Corporation and its control over it. So Petro kicked out the boss of that company and replaced him with his own campaign manager, and instructed this company to turn down potentially very profitable and lucrative deals with Occidental Petroleum, one of the major oil and gas companies in the US, and incidentally, the company that is mostly promoting direct air capture. So Vicky Holub, the CEO of this company, hates Petro and denounces him. You can read about this in Time, a very nice piece published a week ago. Denounces him as being anti-coal, anti-gas, anti-oil, and anti-the United States. So fossil capital detests Petro because he is the only world leader that takes the idea of a limit seriously and is trying to implement it in terms of phasing out fossil fuels. And he also, and Susanna Mohammed, we shouldn't forget about her because she's very important in this process. And she just unveiled a massive public investment program for this transition. And what they're saying is that we're going to turn Colombia away from producing fossil fuels to instead producing solar and wind, the potentials of which are enormous in this country as in so many others, but haven't been exploited anywhere near their potential. And we're going to export electricity produced by solar and wind through a trans-American grid. Now, this sounds too good to be true because we're so starved of positive examples, but it's good to keep in mind. I think, progressive forces and people interested in climate in the global north should engage with what's going on in Colombia much more, because it's the only case of an ongoing transition away from fossil fuel production to something else that we have right now in the world. And it's in the global south. I mean, you would imagine that a rich country producing fossil fuels would do this because it would be much easier for Norway or Canada or Australia or the UK or the US, highly diversified, the most advanced economies on the world. They could afford to ditch fossil fuels much more easily than a country in the periphery in the global south, such as Colombia, which has, underdeveloped and become dependent on these export revenues to a degree that doesn't apply to any of these other countries. But it happens there. And of course, the reason for this is that Latin America, it happens in the global south for different reasons, but in Latin America more specifically, because that's the only continent where left forces retain the capacity to seize state power on the base of social movements. I mean, we have a case of a recent case of a left winning a national election in the global north in France, but they were immediately robbed of that election victory. But here, there is a fundamental victory that still exists, although one have to ask for how long. I mean, I have a comrade who says that every morning that Petro is still alive is a surprise to me because he threatens so deep interests. And of course, this government is facing obstacles, like I said, including various types of investment strikes. So now, investors worldwide are shunning Colombia because they're creating this extremely insecure environment for business and for investment. And the classical contradiction of a reformist conquest of the state is emerging here because you have now a left-wing government, but you have a deep state with various, close ties to the bourgeoisie in Colombia. And this kind of deep state is, of course, obstructing the work of Petro and Mohammed and their government. So, but I'm going on this rant because I think we should engage with this living, ongoing experiment, because it's a kind of a luxury that we actually have one case in this world of almost complete darkness, and try and see what they're doing and maybe visit them, talk to them, and try to learn the lessons from what they're doing in Colombia, and see if we can import these lessons into even more significant fossil fuel producers in the global north, because it's when that happens, if you would have a Colombian government with a Colombian policy in the UK or in Australia or in Canada or in Norway or even the US, someone like Bernie Sanders running the US, not Donald Trump, in that moment, you will have potentially a much greater challenge for fossil capital and something like asset stranding on a much larger scale than what you have when this is happening in Colombia. Okay, sorry for the rant.
No, that's why you're here. I've got some more questions at the back. We had.
You online as well?
Okay, but we had a question. Did you have a question? Yeah, you. Right, and then some in the previous round there was yes and then yes, right? So we'll go. You were late. You don't get a question. I'll come to you. Well, maybe. I don't know. Maybe.
It's worse.
Can we talk about the media, the right-wing media, the new forces on social media, about how they are providing the social license for continued denial and for ideas like net zero and all of these problems around overshoot? Yeah, and maybe how we tackle the right-wing media and shut them down somehow.
Media.
Cool. Two quick ones, if that's okay. The first one, do you think 1.5 is still a good target? You're saying that governments are now hiding behind it, but at the same time, crossing it is too dangerous. So I wondered how those kind of mirror each or match each other. And the second question quickly is, in terms of making the most difference in reality, so when we go and speak to decision makers at COP, how do we bridge the ideas you're saying, which I completely agree with, we need complete systematic change, with people who don't want that or people want the status quo? So where do you think the one idea where we could bridge this gap the best lies?
Hi. Over the weekend, Ed Miliband came out with a piece in The Guardian saying that Britain by 2030 will be completely energy efficient, homegrown energy it will be green apparently. And I wonder if you think the current Labour government, being another neoliberal government, is actually capable of this, if this is even realistic in any way.
Okay, right. We should have another time for another round of questions, but the first question was about the role of complicit media. I don't know, right? The role of the media in perpetuating these narratives of overshoot. Then we've got this idea of, I suppose, how can we engage policymakers who, when you start talking off about what's considered to be policy relevant, which seems to be a light years away from where we might be. And then some pointed questions about the current UK administration, that like the Labour government's credibility to actually deliver on some of what it's promising.
You just broke up with social media, so you have to answer the first one.
No. I don't have a fresh experience.
Experience is just that I deleted my Twitter account. That's not a very fresh experience. I mean, it's a very good question, and okay, the role of the media is obviously super crucial in this. I think my hobby horse in some ways is this kind of the many abstractions of climate change that are often talked about, right? I mean, when we talk about climate change, it's often in terms of emissions, or it's in terms of greenhouse gas, blah blah. I mean, it's very kind of depoliticized, the kind of narratives, and I think the media propagates this very easily. So, I mean, there's a massive role here for better communications, not just the media, but definitely, yeah, especially independent media, to make these connections between what is actually happening in terms of disasters and concrete perpetrators, not just abstract emissions somewhere, but real fossil fuel investments, real fossil fuel producers. And of course, a lot of people are doing that. We have one example in the book where there's attempts to kind of quantify how many deaths are being caused, for example, by investments or certain amounts of emissions. So I mean, we just need a better language, a better metric, a better way of communicating climate change in many ways. That's just one, general observation. But yeah, I mean, obviously we have a media landscape that is now totally dominated, controlled by billionaires, which is a massive problem. And It's been super fascinating to see the reaction to Elon Musk's takeover of former Twitter, I guess. And how many people have a problem or you know, are struggling with, you know, getting rid of this massive followership that they still have there. I know you've been an active promoter of not being on Twitter. I'm now on Blue Sky. Please, everybody follow me. No, but obviously, you know, we need to be. I mean, also like what is happening with the election in the US, you know, it's an indication of just like how much control the media has about and social media in particular about the kind of information we get about climate change. So I have, yeah, I'm rambling. I have no real yeah. Say something.
Say something about the 1.5 degree target. Is it good?
Yeah, this is also you know, I struggle with this one because if one looks at the 1.5 degree target historically, it's been a massive mobilizing kind of narrative for, I mean, the climate movement and especially kind of developing small island states, right? They are the ones that put the target on the Paris Agreement agenda. Having that in there in some ways was a victory for them. But it's been a poisoned kind of a Trojan horse in many ways, right? As any climate target, I mean, or I don't know if talking about climate targets has really helped us in a way, rather than, you know, maybe talking about concrete fossil fuel investments, for example. Or I think much of what is happening now with like this shift towards a non-proliferation treaty, for example, fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, is much more productive than pushing for like concrete limits, because as we've seen, you know, it's you know, if you start having an overshoot limit, then, you know, 1.5 doesn't really mean anything. I personally, I have a hard time letting go of 1.5 completely, even though, as you know, I've shown in the first graph, we're really almost there, right? But I think we have a political responsibility to keep pushing the boundaries of what is possible. Now, 1.5 degrees is probably beyond what's possible if you really start thinking about what it would mean. But the whole point of this conversation and this presentation I gave in the beginning is that we need to question and broaden how the boundaries are set around what is possible in terms of mitigation. Currently, they're being set in very conservative ways that are in line with business as usual, that, you know, deny you know, the need for reductions in energy use, for example, that deny the possibility to go towards a more degrowth form of economy, that just question the general political economic system that's responsible for this problem in the first place. And as long as we have models and, you know, media that, you know, works within those boundaries, we need to keep pushing that towards more ambitious targets. We could probably do that without 1.5 degree, but I think there's a point in like continuing to, you know, raise the bar somehow. But yeah, this is a huge conversation about like what have these temperature limits actually done politically, and have they been counterproductive given, you know, the whole notion of overshoot, and also yeah, just the fact that, you know, obviously policymakers can just ignore them. So you take.
Okay, just to add on the question of media and Twitter and the figure of Elon Musk, he really, if Trump is the personification of the absence of the reality principle, Musk kind of embodies the fusion of overshoot ideology and climate denialism. So he's the patron of this Carbon X Prize, right, that we write about in the second book, and he has, promoted himself as a supporter of carbon dioxide removal and various startups and new technologies. And he's also going on, insane climate denialist diatribes. He did this in this interview or his talk with Trump. What was it that he said? I don't remember, but it's like, outrageously bizarre statements denying the reality of it.
The concentrations of CO2, at which point we might actually suffocate. That's why.
Yeah. CO2 is not a problem before we actually suffocate from it, something like that.
That was in parts per million.
And he's also, of course, the czar of Twitter, now X. So yeah, it's fascinating how the leading figures of the US the dominant class in the US really, without any kind of mediation, combines base and superstructure and, in a very crude fashion, represent the worst processes of capital accumulation. Anyway, on 1.5 degree as a target, I agree with Wim. I think we have to recognize that this target is being missed. It would be, it would be at this moment, and I think this sort of what do we call them? Oh, yeah. Anyway, that it would be. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it would be a kind of a departure from reality to insist on the viability of the 1.5 degree target where we are at this moment. That said, I'm personally a little bit like Wim in favor of keeping that target, and I would also be in favor of a 1 degree target or even a 0 degree target. And I wouldn't object to keeping the 350 ppm target that Bill McKibben's climate organization has, of course, inscribed into its own name, or aim even higher or lower at 280 or something like that. What any target of this kind now means is that we have to have an immediate abolition of fossil fuel production, and then do everything we can to draw down as much as possible of the excess CO2 in the atmosphere. But it has to begin with an immediate abolition of fossil fuel production. To take an analogy, I don't know if you're going to appreciate it, but I can't resist doing this. On the question of Palestine, I'm totally in favor of the right of return for the Palestinian refugees of 1948. But what's happening on the ground right now is the production of ever more refugees, because the refugees from 1948 have their refugee camps destroyed on top of their heads and are becoming refugees again and again and again and again, and the displacement just continues in a way that's totally analogous to the situation on the fossil fuel front. And the return to Palestine begins with a stop to the production of new refugees and even more displacement. And this means that, our fight really is to reverse deep historical wrongs, but we're in a moment where these wrongs are still just being multiplied. So when we kind of formulate goals, they have to speak to the central political mission, which is to stop the ongoing production of more damage and then try to restore as much as possible. On the question of the Labour government, I have to acknowledge that Wim and I finished this second, much larger book in early September. And when did you have the election here? When Labour won?
4th of July.
Oh, it was that early. Okay. Anyway, I was deeply into writing this book together with Wim, and once I was done, I kind of switched off. So I haven't followed what's happened with the Labour government and what they're doing. I don't have much trust in Starmer, but that's kind of based on prejudice, I guess. I'm not up to date with what they're doing. But what you told us about Miliband, does this also mean that the Labour government has given up on the principle that all recent British governments have had, namely to exploit the oil reserves in the North Sea to the maximum? Because that has been the principle for all these governments. Have they given up on that?
100%. Maybe other people know. My
yeah, I
was
know.
really the idea. Do you think we could actually? Do you think it's possible for us to make a green transition under a neoliberalist government, which Labour is? So, because they're claiming that this will be a green transition of sort, and we're going to source our own energy. Sorry to interrupt.
Just to say on the North Sea, Miliband said there would be no new licenses. Just before losing power, Sunak granted 100 new licenses.
Yeah.
But the offshore petroleum regulator has put a hold on the assessment of any new environmental statements while they're consulting on a legal victory that I actually won. But so the North Sea is currently on hold, and in 2025 there will be guidance to the offshore to whoever the decision makers as to whether or not they can allow any new North Sea fields. So actually it is quite an exciting time in Britain from that respect, although Ed Miliband's also putting 22 billion into carbon capture and storage.
Okay, so this seems to be the Danish line, because this is what Denmark did in its sector of the North Sea a couple of years back. They said, we're not going to give any more new licenses, but the licenses that already exist, we're going to respect, which commits us to another 40 or 50 years of extraction.
The licenses, because it's a two-stage thing, they've got licenses, but they haven't got the field development plans, and they can't proceed with applying for those.
So these could potentially be stopped as well.
Anything that's just licensed, but they haven't actually got the development plan, is on hold.
Okay.
So it's not a bad outcome.
Sounds potentially promising, and I think for a significant fossil fuel producer, this is at the core of it. If you look at Norway, they have all of these electrical vehicles and they pride themselves of their own energy generation being based on hydropower and all these things. But that's quite immaterial as long as Norway keeps expanding fossil fuel production, which is totally committed to doing. And of course, Norway is much larger than the UK as a fossil fuel producer. So what's really important if you're in a country that produces fossil fuels is, are you intent on continuing with that or stopping it? This is the key, not whether your own electricity sector is based on fossil fuels or not, because the world really doesn't care if the Norwegians drive electrical vehicles. What the world cares about, in some objective sense, is whether Norway extracts fossil fuels or not. Because as soon as you have extracted fossil fuels, this means that they will be burnt somewhere, and you will have even more CO2 into the atmosphere.
I'm being furiously signaled that we may have run out of time.
Right.
Because the time is actually a little bit afterwards than I said it would be. So we are out of time. But we do have a little bit of time before we are going to run away somewhere else. Because I know there's a load of more questions and lots more interesting discussion to be had. I just want to thank you guys for coming again. I know it's been a super hectic time, and I want to thank you all for turning up. I can't just help comment on the abolition question. Some people like to make the analogy between the abolition of slavery and the state kind of finding its moral compass. And the interesting thing about the UK abolition of slavery is that it was precipitated by the Jamaican uprising, which was the threat of violence. I mean, the state found its moral compass because it was seriously concerned it was going to lose the colonies because of the slaves were just going to basically trash the place. And so that's how it enacted a swift abolition. But what people often don't know is that the state paid the slave owners. They transferred essentially 40% of the UK annual budget to pay slavers. So they profited on the way up and they profited on the way down. So that comment about 21 billion pounds being spent on carbon capture storage, most of which will ultimately make its way to the fossil fuel industry, shows that perhaps we haven't learned much from that period of history, other than maybe we need to blow some shit up to actually get some progress. So thanks once again. Apologies online, but Wim and Andreas, thank you.